welcome to Mindscapes, our series of conversations with men and women whose ideas, vision and philosophy define our contemporary world. My guest today is a man of so many parts that I found it difficult to introduce him. He's a writer, a poet with a published chronology of more than 38 works of poetry and literary criticism. He's been a founder of numerous institutions, a civil servant of distinction, a cultural activist, a cultural administrator, et al. I'm delighted to welcome Ashok Vajpeyi. How have you coped with these very many identities, including being a civil servant? In recent years, it's become sort of fashionable for civil servants to also sort of, write books and write novels and be in the media in some ways. But you have so emphatically and distinctly combined so many different dimensions.
Well, now that you ask me, it looks a bit of a surprise to me as well. But how did I manage it? But right from the beginning, I became a writer, a poet, much before I became a civil servant. I started, shall we say, nourishing the ambition of dying as a poet when I was very young, barely 13 or 14. And that desire has never left me. So my first priority, in any case, was my creativity. And it so happened that one had to. I was in two minds when I qualified for both the Indian administrative and the foreign services, whether I should go into them at all. I was teaching, and I was quite happy teaching. I thought teaching is a good profession. But then I found that it was also soul-killing in many ways. So I said, let me take this chance. My father said, who was a university administrator, that jump into it. Mm-hmm. If you find that it is no good, just jump out of it and go to Oxford and do your PhD or whatever. So,
well, have you found the sensibility of a poet and that of a civil servant sometimes at odds?
Well, in a manner of speaking, yes, and in another, they are complementary. You see, a poet can sometimes lose touch with reality, with raw reality, with a lot of human suffering, which is part of reality that we face it. One can become immune, one can be taken up by one's dreams and visions. But as a civil servant, you have to face reality and suffering day by day. So it gives you a sense of sort of reality, should I say. It keeps you rooted there.
Well, I must say that's sort of the most generous description of a bureaucrat's satisfactions that one could say.
No, I wouldn't say that was entirely so peaceful, such a peaceably tense existence all the time. There were occasions when people thought that among the civil servants, fellow bureaucrats, etc., that I was not doing my job, that in fact I was making pleasure my work. Others were trying to make work their pleasure, but I was doing the other way around. But then I decided that here was an area called culture in which state governments very seldom do anything. If they do anything, they do it with a lot of coarseness and insensitivity. Now, can I bring my creativity to bear upon it and do something?
Of course, that was sort of has been a major sort of achievement of your career. I was going through the list of institutions you founded, and there are at least, more than a dozen major institutions. Yeah. And you are currently heading the Mahatma Gandhi International Hindi University.
That's right.
What made it happen? Was it just sort of coincidence that you were able to sort of steer your bureaucratic career into managing, setting up and establishing institutions, and sort of cultural institutions at that?
Well, partly I decided that this was an area where a lot of initiative needs to be taken. Luckily for me, this was an area in which the politicians and other bureaucrats were not interested. So I was not coming in the way of anybody. They kind of thought that here is a madcap who wants to do a bit and let him do it in his own way. Then as I started doing it, and as it started attracting attention and having some kind of an impact in the creative community, etc., and the media, then it it became a matter of somewhat prestige to, let's say, Madhya Pradesh at that time, that this was being done, so there were not many people to encourage you. But of course, there were bitter ideological fights, and the politician being sidelined and the artist being brought into the sun was not something that would be stomached very easily. But I fought that battle somewhat stubbornly and not giving in. And because I didn't have a bureaucratic ambition, you know, so there was nothing that they could do to sort of suppress my enthusiasm and all that.
Your sort of work with Bhopal Bhavan
Yes.
was at one point somewhat controversial, got a lot of press, got a lot of attention.
Yes.
How does one sort of internally, how do you cope with, you know, you start doing something with good intentions, you have a dream, you have a vision, and you feel you're acting from integrity, and there are people who are now standing up and casting aspersions on it. What does that do to an individual?
Well, it does a lot of damage.
I mean, does it lead to a sort of a coarsening of sensibility? You're an artist, there's a different level of sensibility and aesthetic. And something coarse happening like that around you, what happens to you?
Well, I mean, in the sense, partly my poetry and my other life, if you like, helped me so that I could withdraw from this onslaught and internalize it in a manner and you know, worry about eternity. It's like worrying about eternity or ensconcing in eternity when you're faced with time, you know, that kind. But on a deeper level, I thought that this started maturing me in many ways. I was innocent about many things. I thought politics is not interested. But there's nothing in the world in which politics is not interested. They're not going to leave you alone. They did not leave me alone. So I had these skirmishes, and I had these media bits, if you like, and things of that kind. But two or three things stood firmly. One, I thought I must not give up. It's very easy to, you know, run away.
Right.
Two, that I knew that I was honest and that I was not making money by the side or sort of buying a flat in Bombay, things of that kind. So since I was not doing all that, I was no doubt that nothing can damage me in that sense. And thirdly, I thought a vision, a liberal vision, has to be rehabilitated in public domain. That whatever may be the onslaughts, whatever may be misreadings and misunderstanding, one should not give up. The liberality of your imagination and the liberality of your vision. That's why I hopefully tried to do. I don't know whether I succeeded.
You know, when you talk of this aspect of liberality of vision, and you're also described as the cultural activist, sort of the whole notion of cultural activism has suddenly come into focus, in a sense, in the liberal community. You know, there is a feeling that you know, the ideology of Hindutva or whatever sort of ways or manners in which you might want to describe or contextualize this, that in some ways cultural activism has taken the form of ideological activism or is impinging on a liberal worldview. You describe yourself as a liberal. How have you responded to the suggestion that there is an effort to rewrite textbooks, to rewrite history, and in a sense intrude on this process of cultural liberalism?
Well, in this, you see, there have been extremities of both kinds. An extremity on the one hand which seemed to think that social reality and social forces are the only forces, and that material existence is the only existence. We have been saying that, well, yes, material existence is important and social reality is very much part of reality, but there are many other realities, including spiritual reality, and you can't bypass them. You can't say that these visions are irrelevant because you are poor, because you are illiterate. After all, the poor and the illiterate need spirituality as much as the rich do. So that was a fight at one level. On the other, that you give up the undeniably pluralistic heritage, which would mean that you would give up your classical music, you will give up your classical dance, you will give up your languages, which are all pluralistic products, if you like. So you had to fight to save the liberal space between the two extremist teams. The point is that whereas one may sympathize with, let us say, the spiritual yearnings of a particular kind, along with the social, shall we say, anxieties of the other, you have to, the liberal would be one who I suppose will try to balance the two and try to keep that both remain valid, not to the exclusion of the other. And that is.
But I think the sort of the debate perhaps is not merely between an emphasis on a social reality and a spiritual reality, but how that spiritual reality is perceived.
Yes.
I mean, there are different visions, different perceptions of a spiritual reality.
Yes.
And the question really arises, what is the role of the state in promoting a particular spiritual reality or its vision of a spiritual reality, and how that might resolve and play itself out?
Well, in the first place, the state had better keep off. The state is a product of social reality and had better remain there. You know, in a sense, in the Indian tradition, the state was always thought to be unreal. You know, you have, of course, the statecraft, and you have treatises on the state and all that. But in a deeply metaphysical sense, the state was thought to be unreal, because there was this other territory which was thought to be more enduring, more real. Now, those kinds of dichotomies perhaps one has to face, but the state, being a product of the social reality, can engage itself in whatever manner it likes with changing, transmuting, controlling, if you like, social reality. But as for the spiritual reality, that is beyond the state in the first place. It's too subtle, too complex, too shall we say, too non-materialistic to be handled by such a coarse instrument as the state. But on the other hand, one can argue that the social reality, once it starts organizing itself in a particular way, would promote a certain kind of, let's say, metaphysical view of man and universe and this, that, and the other. To that extent, there is an indirect. Now, hopefully, in a democratic polity, the fact that there are others watching you, the fact that there are others who will hold you accountable and responsible, works as a force which should not be undermined, and thereby keep the areas. But I mean, for instance, a lot of people who believe that arts are all a spiritual matter and social reality is all a very material. This is not true. Arts also need a lot of social reality. I mean, a painter needs galleries, and performers need auditoria, and you need museums and things of that kind, which will be part of, if you like, of the social reality. So it's a difficult and complex matter, but I would still think that whatever may be the extremities, in India it is still possible, because of its essentially democratic polity, to keep the liberal space is still active, responsive, and sort of trying to cope with the challenges it faces.
As you know, you have been a cultural administrator, and you have mentioned sort of institutions and the role of state. In the context of the globalizations of the economy, the liberalization, the modernization, whatever phrases you wish to use, fundamentally it implies a retreat of the state from what it considers areas that are not essential. And one of the first casualties we've seen, certainly in the Western world, has been the arts, sort of the support of the state for the arts. In what ways and how do you see the support for the arts, for this spiritual realm that you talk about? And I should hasten to add that I think it's important we draw a distinction between art as spirituality and sort of the religious aspect and religion spirituality. So looking at art as spirituality, of finer aspects of human existence, of human sensibility, what do you think is a balanced view in terms of how the state and government, shall we now just sort of get down to it, should support and interface with the arts? I
would cite the example of Madhya Pradesh, where I worked. I was the civil servant in charge of culture. I tried to function in a manner that the state will provide all the resources, but would not interfere ideologically. I prevented the state from having a say in that. Now this is an ideal situation. This may or may not happen. So, like in the West, the civic society, actually art has been more a civic responsibility than, let's say, a political responsibility. Now, unfortunately in India, the civic responsibility has different layers and levels of development in various parts. I mean, look at the Hindi belt, where the non-official initiative is very, very limited. In Maharashtra, on the other hand, it is very strong. In Gujarat, perhaps very strong. So, you cannot subscribe or you cannot prescribe a particular kind of a model. But surely, ultimately, the society must take responsibility for its culture and arts.
But do you think it's sort of more prevalent in Gujarat and Maharashtra because they have more money, they're more developed states financially than say, UP and Bihar and most of the Hindi belt?
No, I'll give you the example of Assam, for instance. I've been there to inaugurate the Assam Sahitya Sabha in a small place called Hajo. It was incredible. There were 150,000 people assembled in that small place just for the love of their language. Now, Assam is one of the most underdeveloped and very neglected areas, and yet people care for their language, for their literature, for their arts. So it's not directly relatable to that. It's only a certain kind of traditions that have come up. Perhaps this Hindi belt had been busy fighting or doing, suffering all the political turmoil, so it did not develop those, shall we say, the more conservative, conserving in the sense of conserving rather than being opposed to change, kind of institutions and forces in as many areas as was desirable.
You're a Hindi poet, and at a time when it seems that the intellectual vitality in the arts it seems somewhat sort of declining, certainly compared to, say, 50 years ago. We no longer seem to have sort of the same great names, the same intellectual rigor or vigor in the processes, in writing, in poetry, well, you see that applied to theatre, to film, to across the board of the arts. What do you think are some of the facts? Why do you think this has sort of happened in recent decades?
Well, even now, although those big names are not there, I would imagine that even now there are 50, 60 writers in various Indian languages who are first rate. Now, at no time a country, even with this kind of multilinguality, can afford to have more talent than that in the first place. But it is true that earlier, soon after independence and in 60s, 70s, there was a new fervor, there was a new sort of camaraderie which was built around, etc. Now, many factors, a kind of, shall we say, lumpenization of polity, criminalization of politics, all this seem to have created, seem to have undermined, shall we say, the young creativity in a manner that not many people now seem to be attracted to such dismal arts as verse making, for instance, which I have been practicing for nearly 50 years. So, I mean, that is one. But the second, the more importantly, I think in the life of a nation, these things do happen. After all, before freedom, we had some of the greatest names, free spirits, Rabindranath Tagore, Mahatma Gandhi, Prem Chand, Nirala, what you have, there's a whole lot of people, in a country which was not a free country. On the other hand, in the last 50 years, I can still make a list of 100 top-notchers in music, in theatre, in cinema, in literature, which can compare with the best in the world. So it's a matter of how you are looking at it.
You have, raised sort of two phrases several times in our conversation. One was sort of the poet and eternity, in a sense of timelessness, and your work passionately reflects that. And you've also used the idea of that you want to die a poet.
Yeah.
And the third thing you've described yourself is sort of the dismal art of poetry.
Yes.
Do I see a pattern there?
Well, you do and you don't. in the sense that deep down in my heart, I am a lonely man, somewhat sad at the predicament of man, which for me also includes in our time a loss of the sacred, which in the Indian tradition is also simultaneously the loss of the erotic. I tried in my small way to make the sacred and the erotic come together again in whatever memorable way they could. I don't know whether I succeeded. And therefore, there is a sadness that this is not so, and then there is a bit of exuberance here and there in terms of action and the life of action, where I don't seem to have given up hope. So, I mean, but these are the dualities of existence a man lives by anyway.
When you say you haven't given up hope, what is it that drives this hope? Is it an external circumstance, elements that you see in the social reality around you, or is it just an innate optimism about the cycles and the processes of life and the flow of life, and hence it leads to an optimism of a kind?
Well, I would say both. There is an inner, shall we say, an inner feeling that we are part of a continuum, and that this is not the end of life, that this may be the end of living, but life continues beyond you. And for a poet, life continues in his words and his works, hopefully beyond his short span of life. On the other hand, in the social reality also, you keep on meeting people. I mean, I am very fond of Hindustani classical music. Everybody would say that instrumental music, for instance, is the more glamorous, there's more money in it. But some of the most talented young people today are in the Hindustani vocal music. So there is this hope which is coming from these kinds of movements which you find, and which therefore in a manner supports your optimism on the one hand, but the essential sad loneliness also survives.
You mentioned the sort of the erotic and the sacred.
Yes.
And certainly in terms of the modern psychology, modern psychiatry, that they are really seen as opposites and the sources of great conflict. And whereas I think that our tradition had resolved the issue or the harmonizing of the sacred and the erotic, don't you despair that with sort of the globalization of culture and mass culture in India, that in fact the separation is being heightened?
Oh yes, it is. And therefore, I think for our kind of inheritance, there is a combative moment arriving. Because we had married the two, because we did not dichotomize between the sacred and the erotic, maybe we can do something different to this global process of their divergence. We can bring it together. In fact, there might be a hope for the Indian arts. The pity is that many of us who do not inherit consciously or do not want to inherit deliberately this combination of the erotic and the sacred, the Western dichotomy is final and complete. I don't think this is so. And we have this inheritance. I mean, the Indian Shringar, for instance, has been a great tradition. And it is a tradition which is even now being kept alive. Let's say in Indian classical dance and Indian classical music. There's no reason why it should disappear, let's say in literature or in architecture or wherever.
Are you one of those sort of artists, cultural pundits, who fear that the globalization of culture will in some way overwhelm us, will diminish our own culture and threatens it? You know, don't forget that in the WTO, even the French stood up and said, no, we will not allow more than 60% that we will have 60% of programming which is French, and
Yes.
we will not allow more than a certain amount of exposure to other values
Yes.
alien to us. Do you see that as a threat? Would you advocate sort of a more vigorous assertion of our cultural identity, more protection of our cultural identity by limiting exposure to?
No, I wouldn't want any limiting of exposures. But what I would certainly like that the forces and the elements within our tradition and contemporary creativity which are able to cope with these challenges are also encouraged. After all, look at modernism. When it came to India, it appeared that it will completely overwhelm it. But ultimately, we did develop what is an Indo-centric modernism, which has combination of an openness and certain continuities of elements from before. Now, I am not afraid. I'm quite sure that we are not just a country. We are a civilizational enterprise. India is a civilizational enterprise. And we have been there for several centuries, coping with all kinds of outside influences, and we have never closed ourselves. I don't want that we should be closed, but we should be aware, deeply suspicious of the challenges that come and cope with them, domesticate them like we have in the 20th century. 20th century, in fact, in India would be a century also known for domesticating modernism. Look at the technology, the new technology, the cinema. Cinema started here almost simultaneously as in Europe. And look at the way we have converted cinema into an entirely Indian phenomenon, although the technology is a 20th century technology. It was not even born here.
What agenda do you set for yourself? You still have a long, productive career ahead of you, even though that of a civil servant might be drawing to a close.
Oh well, I always had an agenda of dreams, and these dreams are I want to write a verse play without taking recourse to mythology or historical narrative. I want to write a long narrative of the 20th century in Indian arts and literature, a personal account. I want to do a series of articles on missed modernism. For instance, I think we had 4 moments of modernism which we seem to have missed. One was Amir Khusro, the second was Kabir, third was Tulsidas, the fourth was Ghalib. Now, I want to trace this and things of that kind.
Well, this is sort of tantalizing enough for another conversation. I hope we'll meet again on the program. Thank you very much. This has been a great privilege.